So I'd like to welcome everybody to our fifth Applied U webinar, sponsored by Bentley University and the Association for Applied and Clinical Sociology. For those who don't know, my name is Gary David, and I am, amongst other things, the immediate past president of the Association for Applied and Clinical Sociology. Our main reason for AACS and also Bentley for these webinars is to provide professional development and educational opportunities for our members and other interested parties alike. And we always try to provide varied content to educate people on what is sociology, how sociology can be applied, and also demonstrate how it can be integrated into both educational settings, governmental, nonprofit, and business settings, and especially here with Bob today, user experience design. We are fortunate, really fortunate, to have Dr. Robert Moore from IBM to discuss conversation analysis for user experience design. I've known Bob for a long time. We were graduate students together, not at the same place, but it's always been exciting for me to always see the new work that Bob has been doing as a person who is both a sociologist, an ethnomethodologist, and a conversation analyst. And this work he's going to be talking about today is based off of his current projects at IBM, and actually two books he just published. One book, which is an edited collection put out by Springer, that's titled Studies in Conversational UX Design. And if you're interested in that, you can buy that for the low, low price of $109. And also another book that Bob is going to be publishing here shortly, I believe through ACM. Is that right, Bob?
Yeah.
Right. A few housekeeping items before we begin. If you have any questions, please provide them in the chat box located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're going to try, as Bob said earlier, hold off on questions till the end of the webinar. We are recording the webinar, and a copy of it will be uploaded to the AACS Applied U YouTube site. And there's also past webinars up there, such as Sociology for Experience Design, Crafting Your Sociological Brand, Grantsmanship of Qualitative and Mixed Methods Research, and also Social Entrepreneurship. I would also tell people that next month we're going to have a webinar on managing diversity in organizations. So again, we're trying to keep the content varied and lively to hit on those things of interest to everybody. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Moore. Bob, take it away.
All right, thanks. So I'm Bob Moore. I'm a research scientist at IBM Research Almaden. This is in San Jose, California. And I will be talking about the latest work I'm doing on conversational UX. So before I do that, let me talk a little bit about myself. For, I guess, 20 years now, I've been working as a sociologist in Silicon Valley research labs. I started at the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, or PARC, back in '99. I went to Yahoo Research, and now I'm at IBM Research. There was also a brief stint at a startup in the middle of that. So that's sort of where I come from. I mean, these are really interesting places. They're kind of, in between industry and academia. Of course, they are located in industry, but in each of these research centers, it's the research organization or division within the larger company. And so basically, we have the mandate of inventing the future. And as a result, we are, working on problems that will lead to solutions that are a little further out than the product groups have the luxury of worrying about or working on. The product groups are very much, working toward the next quarter or the next year. In research, we can think about longer term problems, maybe 2 years to 5 years, sometimes more than that out. And so it's really interesting. We publish in academic journals, go to conferences, but we also work with clients, and we're supposed to have both. We aim to have both an impact on the company, but also on the research community. So they're great places. Each of these places had a real mix of different kind of researchers. So as you can see, they're small campuses that have anywhere from, right now at Almaden, we've got people pushing atoms around, single atoms around on the first floor. I guess that would make them physicists. And we've got social scientists, and of course at all of them, there are lots of computer scientists. But it's a real mix, the real interdisciplinary places, great places to work. Okay, so research labs. So more specifically, what does a sociologist do? And I have to admit, you know, there are not a lot of sociologists. There are some anthropologists and sociologists. So I'm not the only one, but we are in the minority compared to some of the other fields, and certainly computer science and software engineering. But things I've done in the past, I've done quite a few work practice studies. I'm sure Gary's probably talked about work practice studies before. For, you know, and actually, let me say more generally, my work I would describe as at the intersection of social interaction and technology. And so with work practice studies, that might be how employees are using technology in doing their work and coordinating their work, or producing technology through their work. I've also done studies on technology-mediated social interaction. So, for example, virtual worlds or online games where we have humans communicating, but they're communicating through, you know, a pretty heavy technology medium, as well as human-computer interaction. For example, I've done eye tracking. Well, I've done eye tracking studies, but they were focused on how users interact with search engines using eye tracking and some other things. So how they interact with the technology. And now I'm working on actually, rather than studying how humans interact with conversational agents, I'm actually building them and talking about design. So that's even a little different from what I've done in the past. Rather than studying the users of somebody else's technology, I'm actually right in the middle of helping build the technology. So yeah, so that's kind of a range. I mean, you know, the core here is social interaction, you know, whether it's, you know, employees or technologies that are trying to, in some way, you know, work like a human interaction. So, yeah, that's, you know, there's always interest in social scientists in these kind of research labs, because, you know, most people are technologists building technology, and so they realize that sometimes they lose sight of the human aspect or the social aspect, and they like to have social scientists to sort of bring them back to the reality of what it means to be human, or to interact with other people. All right, so that's background on me. Today, what I want to talk about are I'll say conversational agents, or more generally, natural language interfaces. So in this sort of realm will be things things like, excuse me, I've got a cough. Trying to get over a cold. It includes things like voice assistants like Siri or Alexa, or chatbots that you might use on your phone or on a desktop computer, or you know, any kind of natural language interface, and sort of where we could go with that, sort of, you know, not just where we are today, but what the future of that could look like. So that's the area. So I would say, you know, actually a lot of these systems that are out today are not really conversational agents in a strict sense of the word. They are natural language interfaces, but the question is, how can we make them work more like a human conversation, or a conversation? So in that topic, and I don't know if we have a burning question there, but so actually, let me add a little more background. So as you know, my background is in sociology, in conversation analysis in particular. But about 4 years ago, when IBM got interested in natural language interfaces, I sort of put on a different hat, and I learned how to build dialogue flows or conversational user experiences using natural language, and using the current kind of platforms that are, there's a paradigm that uses intents, entities, and context. This paradigm is the same for the IBM product, which is Watson Assistant. It's the same for Alexa, same for Google Home, or Dialogflow, I think is their tool. Microsoft. I mean, that kind of technology is what I've learned to build. And so in doing that, my goal has been to bring together what I know as a conversation analyst, and bring that and leverage that for design of these systems. That's sort of the topic today. There are other technologies, and we can talk about that at some point. But yeah, okay. All right, so that's, again, background. So let me get to the topic itself. So conversational systems today, natural language interfaces, they have three basic components. And so on the one hand, your system needs to understand what they call natural language. Natural language being things like English, Spanish, and Mandarin, right? There's a systematics to English, and you need, if you're building an automated agent that's going to understand that, you need natural language processing tools to make sense of that natural language. And that language, the natural language processing tools are pretty generic in that they don't really care where the bits of English or Spanish are coming from, whether they're coming from a conversation or a book or a poem or a tweet or whatever. It's all English, and the tools are very generic in that way, that they'll work on any kind of language, natural language from any kind of setting. In addition, your system needs knowledge, right? It needs to not just understand, say, English. It needs to know something useful to say, right? It needs to have some useful information to give the user. So it might know about travel. We've got one system that's a virtual travel agent that will help. It'll recommend destinations and attractions for you to see and help you book flights. Or we've got healthcare systems that know about drug interactions and dosages and things like that. We've done a couple in the entertainment space about movies and movie genres and even movie characters, right? So the knowledge part, that's a separate component, right? It's the entities and the relationships to do with whatever the domain or content is of your application. And there are quite a few tools there also for certainly accessing information, but also doing some reasoning and basically processing knowledge. But the third leg of the stool is interaction. And that is things like, for example, what is the social activity or the form of the interaction that you're trying to build? Is it an agent that's going to do troubleshooting with a user, right? Tell me, what problem are you having? Is it doing this? Is it doing that? Okay, I think this is the problem, and do these steps, right? Troubleshooting has a shape. It has a shape to that interaction. That shape is different from, say, a debate, right? A debate, there's actually not much turn taking in a debate. One person gives a 2-minute argument, and then the other person gives another argument, and you sort of have just a speaker change like once or twice. Quiz game is even different, right? Back, if people remember when IBM's Watson beat Jeopardy, Humans at Jeopardy, that has an interactional structure to it. You press a buzzer, you hear an answer, oddly, and then you have to press a buzzer, and if you press it in time, you then get to formulate the question that goes with that answer, right? That's a very narrow, specific kind of interactional structure. Other things like question and answer, another interactional structure. So that interactional structure is something that is not well supported. There aren't really any tools that help you figure out how to do that. And so to clarify, the platforms I'm talking about, things like Alexa, a Watson Assistant, Google Home, Microsoft, they require that a designer figure out what they call the dialogue flow, right? Or the interaction, basically the interactional structure, right? In fact, if you use one of these systems, you may get a dialogue editor that's a blank page, and you need to figure out the logic that if the user says this, the agent's going to say that, or if the user says this, the conversation is going to ask a backend for some data. It's going to get it back, and then it's going to give it back to the user. And so there's a human in the loop here, and it's a designer. It should be the designer. Often it's not the designer. In fact, even a couple years ago, there wasn't really a designer. There was the system developer who was putting together the whole application, was sort of in charge of creating the user experience, of the dialogue flow, and that's not good, because first of all, they don't want to do it, and second of all, they don't have the time to do it, and they don't have the background to do it. But even if you do have a UX designer, we don't provide many tools for how to do that. We basically, in using the tools, we rely on your common sense as a human speaker as to how to model these interactions. So this is kind of a missing piece, and this is the piece that I've been trying to support. So I've created what I call the natural conversation framework. It's a design framework that is trying to fill this gap around interaction modeling. So it provides the designer with guidance on how to structure the interaction. So it works like a conversation. And here I'm taking findings from the field of conversation analysis, and I'm translating them or adapting them for a dialogue designer or a UX designer who's creating a conversational interface. And like I said, I've been doing that role for about the last 3 or 4 years. I've learned how to do it. So I do this role myself as well. And I've been trying to, anyway. So instead of just pointing designers at the conversation analysis literature, which would be inadequate because conversation analysts are not really, they're not really concerned with building conversational agents. I've tried to, to make it more accessible. So that's what I'm doing at a high level, trying to provide this missing piece by bringing in the conversation analysis literature. So what does that look like? So just to provide an analogy, and I'll try to hurry through this actually. So if you think about now a different kind of design, you think about web design. Web design is a pretty mature discipline. There are standards. This is the IBM website from 2016. It looks great. We've got it's pretty sophisticated in terms of graphical elements, things like color palettes and the typography and high-res images, as well as well-known interactive elements like the search box and the hamburger menu up in the upper right. I learned that that's called a hamburger menu, and as well as some other social media icons. We know how those work, right? It's a mature discipline. You can hire a web designer to create something like this, and it will, you'll get, you know what to expect because there are conventions in this discipline. But 20 years ago, the IBM website looked like this, right? 20 years ago, the technology was out in the hands of the masses. So the web tools were out there, but there was not yet a field of web design, a discipline of web design. There were not yet conventions on how to do it well. And I remember creating websites just like this using Netscape. Netscape had an editor that came with it. And, at that time, it was actually an exciting time because we were still experimenting with this new thing called the web, but there was not yet a mature discipline of web design. And one of the things that got us from here to here, not the only thing, but one of the things is that you could take formal knowledge from graphic design and apply it to this technology and end up with things that look like this, right? It looks like a glossy magazine, right? And a lot of the principles and conventions from graphic design for print and for other, for print medium can be applied and repurposed for web. But that formal knowledge doesn't help us when we get to conversational interfaces. And I would argue that with conversational interfaces, we're back in 1996. We're at the equivalent of 1996, where the tools are in the hands of the masses. We see lots of Amazon Echoes going into houses. We see lots of chatbots here and there. People are building a lot of things, but we don't yet have a common discipline of UX design for conversation. So on the one hand, it's an exciting time because lots of things are happening. But on the other hand, there's no consistency, and I think people are a little bit lost. And I've talked to a lot of UX designers who come in with their knowledge of visual UX design, and now they're being told to design a conversation, and they're kind of at a loss. They don't have the they don't have the background that's needed. And what I'm talking about here is that the user experience for a conversational application is the sequence of utterances, right? It's primarily in the sequence of utterances, not in the chat window if there is a chat window. And of course, if you're using a voice, a smart speaker, there's no visual interface other than the hardware device. And so my basic proposal here is that we need to, instead of bringing in, just like we brought in formal knowledge of graphic design back for the web, now we need to bring in some formal knowledge from social science, bring that into the UX design problem, and define a new or build a new discipline of conversational UX design, because it's clearly UX design. It falls into that umbrella, but it requires a different set of skills, and that's the gap that I've been trying to fill. Okay. So another quick point. So with these current systems that I've been talking about, like Alexa and Watson Assistant, etc. Like I said, the designer has a kind of a blank slate as to how they structure their dialogue flow or their conversation or their interaction. And there's different kinds of styles you'll see. They all involve natural language, but I would argue that they don't all necessarily involve conversation, unless you in a very loose way, just define conversation just as any exchange of bits of natural language, which as a conversation analyst, I don't. So you see some systems that are really pretty system-centric. These are they either look like a natural language search, like interacting with Google, where, with Google, you can ask a question or you can write something in natural language. You get back, in this case, they'll usually get back an answer, but sometimes they'll get back a set of documents. And that's it, right? If I say a third thing, or if I take a third turn, right, the next thing I say, it's going to be taken as a new query, right? Everything's a query to Google, to a search engine. If I say thanks, it's going to go look up and see what it can find for thanks, rather than seeing thanks as a response to the request it just fulfilled for me. So it's a two-turn interaction model. You've got a query and you've got a response, and that's it. Similar with command, things like a lot of, not all, but the kind of basic Alexa kind of skill is a command, right? Play this music, and it plays the music. And then if you say something else, it's not part of a conversation. It's another, everything's a command. So that's one paradigm. Another paradigm you have is really very content-centric. And I think this happens when people take an FAQ from the web and they in a very simple way, turn it into a chat bot. And so you have questions and you have very long responses, which are really, they're not really answers to the question. I mean, if you look at this case, am I covered for diabetes screening? That's a yes or no question, right? That could be answered with a yes or no. Instead, you get a paragraph on a topic. And the topic is diabetes screening and sort of everything related to coverage, right? That's another kind of model. That's very heavy on the content. But again, the interaction model is everything's a question and everything gets an independent question. Everything gets a long response. You can also do visual-centric interaction styles, which rely heavily on visual elements. And so they're very web-like or mobile-like with lots of buttons and menus and visualizations. And so here you have visual UX designers applying what they know, and these can work. They can work fine, but they are limited to something with a visual interface. So they don't work with voice only systems. And then the final kind of interaction style, the one that I'm advocating, that I'm shooting for, is hold on one second. Graham, can you try and keep it a little bit quiet? Graham, try to keep it a little bit quiet. The fourth one is conversation-centric, and this is where the interaction itself is designed more like a human conversation. It works like conversation. I mean, conversation is a particular social activity that has a particular structure, right? It's not just any exchange of turns. In the same way that chess is not any movement of pieces around a board. It's got rules to it. There's a way of doing chess. Conversation is the same way. It's got some principles to it. For example, the responses tend to be short. Not only short, but they tend to be economical. They can be expanded. There's a lot of back and forth. And there's certain actions that are inherently part of conversation. Things like okay and thanks, or what did you say? Those are actions that only happen in conversation, not in other kinds of natural language use. And so that kind of system is, it's a particular kind of interaction style that you can build. Now with these platforms, you can build any of these, right? You have a blank page. You can do whatever you want. What I'm going for here is trying to make it work like a human conversation. And so that's the last style here. Now, what are some advantages of this? Well, one is that I think just inherently, we want to be able to talk to technology. I don't think this desire is ever going to go away. We're going to want to talk to it like we talk to other people. I mean, just look at science fiction. We've been able to talk to robots and artificial intelligence for a long time, right? But we haven't been able to achieve it. But the other reason that's important is that you can do things. If you have your interaction style so that it works like a human conversation, then you can use the technologies that humans use to interact with each other. For example, if you take, this is from our virtual travel agent. All right. Can you guys still hear me and see me? Can you guys still hear me and see me?
Yeah, you're good, Bob. We can still see you and hear you.
Okay. I got a warning that said that my internet connection was poor. Okay, so if you look at this style, right, this is conversational, right? Tell me about your trip. I'm going on vacation to Europe. What kind of things do you like to do? Historic places, museums. Okay, my top recommendations are London, Paris, and Rome. An advantage of this is that it's voice friendly. I could do this on a smart speaker, like an Amazon Echo. I could use it with SMS, right? Because it just relies on the words. You know, it doesn't rely on any visualizations or buttons or anything. So if I have this conversational style, I can use it on SMS. I can use it with voice, but I can also integrate it into an experience where I have more visual real estate. So if I have it as part of a whole, say, desktop application, I can enhance it, right? I can provide more information. I can provide graphical elements like photos and maps. I can do things like reflect the entities that were recognized by the system through the conversation as kind of a double check to show what it's understanding. I can even provide we have like a ticker. It's like scrolling tips to help the user kind of, it's kind of a help function, kind of like tooltips. And so, it's the same conversation, exactly the same conversation, but it's enhanced when you get more visual real estate. Also, if I'm in between, if I'm on a mobile device, I can have, on the one hand, I can have a visual, regular mobile app with a visual interface. Maybe it has my itinerary, and then I can bring up a conversation window. Tap here, you tap on the concierge window, it comes up, and you have a chat window. And again, you can, by having the two, you can provide more information through the visual window. Let's see. There we go. I can do, on mobile, I have a bit more control than, just like SMS, and so I can put in the scrolling tips and things like that. So the big picture here is what we call conversation first design strategy or development strategy, very much taking off on mobile first, except instead of designing it for a mobile interface, you design it for a conversational. You design it so that the interaction is fully functional through the words alone, which is going to be voice. So this, you see me in the lower left there. I'm not just sitting by myself. I'm actually talking to an Amazon Echo that's got my conversational agent Alma connected to it. But I talk to the Echo device. So if your conversation works on that device or on SMS, then it'll work on anything. Then you can move across between these different platforms without having to redesign the whole conversation. And as you increase the screen size, you can progressively enhance it with other features. So this is what we call conversation first. And this is the approach that we take. Again, it's not the only approach. Like I said, you can create any kind of interaction style you want. And I wouldn't argue that it's not useful. I mean, web search is incredibly useful. It's just not conversational. Anyway, so that's okay. That's another high level point. So let me move on. And I think I'll kind of skip over this. This is a fun slide with Blockhead. I won't bore you with Blockhead, but basically Blockhead's a little bit like a conversation where you take turns, and instead of placing blocks on top of each other, you produce utterances, and the utterance constrains what the next person will say, but it doesn't determine what they'll say. And so it's kind of an analogy, but more importantly, in building these things, what I noticed, what kind of shocked me is that when I first started talking to teams, I realized that most teams don't even have a vocabulary for talking about the parts of a conversation, right? They're trying to build a conversation-like user experience, but they don't have a systematic way to talk about it. And other teams have different vocabulary that they use. And so at that point, I realized that even just the vocabulary from conversation analysis could be useful. even if you don't go on to use the patterns and principles that I'm gonna talk about, but just having that shared vocabulary is useful. And so in CA we talk about at one level turns or utterances. Basically, we take turns producing utterances, so that we use them kind of interchangeably. This is kind of the atomic level of a conversation. Now, the subatomic level, which I don't have represented, but which Gary mentioned in the beginning of, TCUs, or turn constructional units. Those are the things that an utterance is made out of. It may be a sentence, or it may be a single word or a phrase. And so each utterance may have more than one component in it. It might have, and I don't think I have, well, okay, the one that says, okay, see you tonight. Okay itself is a turn constructional unit. See you tonight is a separate one. Together they make up that utterance. At a higher level, you have sequences, right? And so you have a bunch, they're different, basically two different kinds of sequences, pairs or story sequences, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. And we have a bunch of those going on. So like even the very beginning, there's a greeting sequence. A says hello and B says hi. And we have others as well. There's a request sequence in there. Can I get a ride? Sure, et cetera, et cetera. So, et cetera, et cetera. So there's sequences at the level above the turn, and then at the level above the sequence, we've got activities. And so the opening is a characteristic activity in a conversation. That's how we initiate the interaction and secure the other person's attention. The closing is how we get out of the interaction. And then we usually have some, at least one activity in between, often more than one activity. In this case, it's requesting a ride, right? So here we have we have three activities that make up this conversation. So, and when we talk about a conversation, we're talking about this whole unit. And so that, I think that's something, just having a systematic way of talking about the pieces of the thing you're trying to build is going to be useful. All right, so let me move on now to our solution. So our solution, we call the natural conversation framework, and it's called natural conversation to distinguish it from just natural language, right? Natural language is English or Spanish, right? A natural conversation is the kind of interaction I've just been showing, the kind of interaction you have, that may have an opening or a closing or other kinds of characteristic features. It's a particular kind of natural language use. Natural conversation is a particular kind of natural language use, and that's the one we're focusing on. And therefore, in addition to the NLP, natural language processing, we need to bring in some other systematics of human social interaction, and that's what we get from the conversational analysis. So we've got a framework, and one of the implementations of the framework on the Watson Assistant platform we call ALMA, short for Almaden, where we're from, where we developed it. And it's domain agnostic. It's very generic to any kind of conversation. And so we've done multiple prototypes and even some products in entertainment, hospitality, insurance, medical, office, shipping, travel, fast food, data analytics. It's entirely domain agnostic. And it's got 4 components, which I'll briefly talk about with the time we have left. So the first component is the underlying interaction model. So like I was saying, with some of the other systems, to Google, everything's a query. So most of the systems out there have this 2-turn interaction model where the user, everything the user says might be a command and it'll be treated like a command. And then what they say, whatever the user says next is seen as an independent command. And so it's a 2-turn interaction structure. So it might be a request, it might be interpreted, what the user says might be interpreted by a request, and then the system will try and grant that request. And that together is a sequence. And that's the basic model that most systems have, whether they're voice assistants or chatbots or whatever. And we often see this kind of thing in conversation, but there's another level to it. And there's another level that is specified in the conversation analysis literature, which you need and which the natural conversation framework provides. And so, yes, we have paired sequences like this. I need someplace within walking distance. So this is a hotel concierge virtual agent or automated agent. Manana's is located at 4th and Winchester, right? I've got a request for a restaurant, and I got the granting of that request. But there's and so what we call this the base pair, or the base adjacency pair. And this base pair can be expanded. It can be expanded with additional pairs. And these additional pairs, they're expansions of this base pair. They don't stand on their own. They do work on this pair. They are dependent on this pair. And it's these expansions that are missing from most of the systems that you'll see. And so, for example, one additional pair will be, okay, thanks, you're welcome, right? This is the pair of actions. But it doesn't, you never start with thanks. It doesn't stand on its own. It's responding to this base sequence that came before it. And it does the work of closing it, right? The user asks for a restaurant. The agent attempts to provide one, and the user says, okay, thanks. It closes that sequence. It shows that sequence is complete and the user got what they wanted. You might see, and so we call this an expansion. You might see an expansion that happens at the beginning. Do you know about restaurants? I know a few places. The canonical preliminary, as we call it, is, are you busy tonight? Right? You hear that as a preliminary to an invitation or a request, right? And what these do is they screen the conditions for the first part of that, for the first part of that base pair, right? So if I'm only going to ask you for a restaurant recommendation if I check and see that you know about restaurants. If the system were to come back and say, I can tell you about movie times and movie times and ratings and theaters, you're not going to ask about restaurants. Or if you're at the hotel and you ask somebody, you want to make sure you want to check to see if you're talking to the concierge before you start asking these questions. And so that it plays a screening function. You might get expansions in the middle. What kind of food do you want? Mexican, right? The system may have a requirement. The agent may have a requirement that it get more information. This is what is usually called a slot in the systems today. But these are all slots. There's more than just one kind of slot. The user might say, what are my choices? Around here, Mexican, Japanese, or Indian, right? So these are all expansions that happen in service to this base pair. They do eliciting more information, they do screening, they do closing. They also might do what we call repair, and there can be two classes of repair. You might get a few places, or what did you say? I know a few places, right? These are repeat techniques that get the other person, the other participant to repeat all or part of what they said. And you do this when you had a problem hearing what they said. And this can happen anywhere in the conversation. Or you have paraphrase techniques that deal with understanding problems. So I heard what you said, but I don't understand what you said, and so I can't move forward. And so those are slots as well. And all these together are expandable sequences. This is the underlying model. In any particular case, you may get some mix of these expansions or none at all. But they're there to do conversation management. And that's part of what makes it a conversation. So this expanded sequence model is the first part of our framework. It's the underlying interaction model for all of the things that the agent can do. It's kind of like an accordion, right? You might have the two-part sequence that's completely collapsed, or it may be expanded to different lengths depending on the particular user and depending on what their needs are. All right, so that's the first part. I'm going to actually skip that one because I'm going to run out of time. The second part of the framework is a content format that goes along with that interaction model. And I'll go through this more quickly. Basically, so one thing you can do, so if you have this content, maybe it comes from an FAQ or something like that, to make it conversational, you need to break it up. You need to break it up into pieces. Often, like if you take a standard FAQ, it usually gives an answer in the first sentence. And then it'll go on and it'll give elaborations of that. Or it will give answers to related questions. And it's more like answering, giving information on a whole topic. To make it conversational, you need to break it down into smaller pieces. And so here, what I'm showing is taking that same content and breaking it into some separate intents, separate questions that could be asked about coverage, deductible, copay, as well as requests for paraphrases, like the what do you mean? Part of that can be a paraphrase of the copay question, or preventative, and the paraphrase is preventative. So you, like an accordion, you break it into pieces that now could be expanded to varying degrees. And so the result is the interaction that looks like, instead of just one shot getting all information at once, it might look like this, where user A asked about diabetes screening, they get the sort of the first sentence. If they want more information, they can ask about the deductible and the copay. If they need information on one of those topics, they can say, "What do you mean?" Or "What do you mean by what do you mean by network in network?" So the user can control the level of detail. User B might just do this. User B might just be satisfied with just the short answer. And so it enables the user to control the level of detail depending on what they know, what they're interested in, what extra help they need to understand. All right, so that's the content format. There's a formalization of that, which I won't spend too much time on, but you've got utterances, responses, paraphrases, examples, definitions. You can expand that out. Also, if you have an extended telling, like a story or instruction giving, which I'll hopefully talk about in a couple minutes if I have the time. All right, so that's the content format. So part of the problem here is that you have some content, but you need it in this format that's going to work with the interaction model. And this is one of the hard problems because we have lots and lots of content in the form of books and documents. And a natural language search, like a search engine, will find that document and maybe it'll pull out a blurb or a snippet, as Google calls it, around that. But it's inherently not in this format. And this is the kind of format you need if you're going to deliver it as a conversation. So that's one of the hard problems in this area. All right, pattern language. So the third component is a pattern language. And the concept of pattern language goes back to Christopher Alexander, 1977, who did a book. He's an architect, and he created a book called A Pattern Language, Towns, Buildings, Construction. And he came up with a set of patterns. I think he had like about 200 patterns of different things that you might find in architecture or in city planning. And so, for example, pattern 76 was a house for a small family. And he's got, you see, he's got some principles and he's got some diagrams for how to do that. And so the idea of pattern language is used by software engineers. It's used by some UX designers to provide a set of, not just a library, but a set of patterns that go together and that work together. They're interrelated. And so that's what we've tried to do for conversational UX. So our pattern language, it has 3 classes of patterns. It's got 100 patterns altogether. Am I doing on time? Yeah, I'm going to have to go quickly here. There are a class of patterns that conversational activities. These are like the basic thing you're trying to do in your application. So you've got a travel agent that makes recommendations. Well, you'd use the user inquiry pattern class of patterns there, A1. If you might have an agent that tells stories, like maybe it's for kids and it will tell kids stories. That's A3, extended telling. Or it might give instructions on how to fix things. That's also A3, or et cetera, et cetera. So these are going to be like the basic functionality of your agent. The other classes, sequence level and conversation level management, these are to do with managing those activities. And these are, again, this is what you have when it's a conversation and not just any kind of natural language use. So the repairs, I just showed a couple of repairs in my last example. Sequence closing, I talked about that. And then getting in and out of the conversation. So these are patterns that are designed for that kind of conversation management. That's a list of the names of all of the patterns. Again, there are 100 patterns and sub-patterns. This isn't all the ones that are possible. One goal is to grow this pattern language, but these are ones over the last few years that we've used a lot, and I think they cover a lot of ground. An example of a pattern, here are 2 patterns. Here's a pattern and a sub-pattern. It's the quiz pattern. And a sub-pattern of that on the right. The quiz pattern, the agent asks the user a question. The user can provide a correct answer, and then the agent will confirm it. Now, this can be used for all kinds of things. It can be used for example, a joke. Why can't you trust atoms? They make up everything. That's right. Right. So that's the case where the user gets the answer right. Now, but it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be jokes. It could be trivia. Trivia question. It could be testing the user. Think about a tutor agent that teaches about physics, and then it tests the user, quizzes them on what they've retained. So it could be, it could be a question about friction, and then it evaluates the user's answer. So it's a very generic pattern. A sub-pattern here is where the user gets it wrong. So say the user, again, why can't you trust atoms? You can't see them? Wrong, try again. You tell me, they make up everything, right? So these are the three, for this pattern, there's three things, basically, outcomes or three outcomes from what the user says. They can get the answer right, they can get it wrong, or they can give up, right? And so it's a very generic pattern. That interaction pattern itself is entirely independent of the content. So that's an example of one kind of pattern. Another kind of pattern is this extended telling that I mentioned a minute ago. And I'll go through the example of, we've got the pattern, the formalization of the pattern on the left, and then one example on the right. I'll just go through that. The user says something like, how do I meditate? And the agent then gives a set of instructions. First, sit comfortably. And so instead of giving a paragraph, what the agent does is it gives a set of instructions, and it's interactive. And so at 3, the user can say, okay, do a continuer, or the user can do something else. The user can say that again. What do you mean? Or they can do a repair, or they can do a continuer. And so, for example, they say okay, or goes on to the next one. Next, count each in breath and out breath until you get to 10, then repeat. At this point, line 5, instead of saying okay, the user says, what do you mean? And gets an elaboration. As you breathe in and out, count 1, 2, 3, all the way to 10. All right, finally. So it's an interactive. It's an extended telling. It's a long thing that the agent is saying, but it's broken up into pieces that then are interactive, and the user can control going on to the next one, or going back to the previous part and repairing it, getting a repeat or a paraphrase, et cetera, et cetera. So that's another one. Can be used for instruction giving, storytelling, or any kind of extended telling where the agent wants to say a big long thing, but it breaks it up and makes it interactive. One reason this is important, say it's a set. Say it's talking about a concept in physics. If the user doesn't understand some term in the very first part, the very first sentence, that's going to inhibit their ability to understand the rest of the parts. And so because it's broken up and it's interactive, they can get a clarification right at that first part, and then go on to the next parts with a better understanding. And let's see. Oh, yeah. So I'm going to skip over this example. It's another example of a pattern, and I'm going to have to skip that. Final thing I think I'll have to say is, how do you navigate a conversational interface? Now, with other kinds of interfaces, we've learned how to navigate them, right? There's different ways, whether we're in a command line interface where we're jumping around to unseen directories with cryptic commands, or a mobile interface where we go into an app and we come back to the home screen and we're pinching images and things like that. We've learned, at some point you learned how to navigate that interface. But for conversational interface, how do you navigate it? On the one hand, you can say, well, just talk to it like you talk to a person. Then you find out the systems are too limited and they can't just do anything a person can do. So we really need to give the user some idea of things that the system can always do to help them get around. And of course, we have to implement this as well. So we've got a recommended navigation method that consists of 6 actions the user can always take. They can always say, what can you do? And this checks its capability. This is kind of like global help. It should always be able to answer at least what can you do? And then as well, that can start a conversation about its capabilities. It should be able to talk about its own capabilities, because that's something that's not easily visible. And it's not visible in the way it's visible in a visual interface by having buttons and widgets around. And so anyways, first thing, what can you do? It can talk about itself. What did you say? If it's a voice system, the ability to have the agent repeat itself is critical. This is kind of like going back. Because say there was a noise at the time that it said its thing, you can't hear it. It's critical to be able to get it to repeat itself. Similarly, it should be able to paraphrase itself. This is a kind of local help that you get with any particular utterance from the system. We saw a couple examples of that. It should recognize okay and thanks. This enables the user to close the sequence, to say, yeah, I got what I wanted. We're done with this. The 2, 3, and 4, these are alternatives, right? I might say, okay, okay, or I might say, what did you say, right? Okay or thanks tells me I'm done with getting getting doing repairs on that previous part. I'm done and ready to move on. Similarly, never mind, instead of closing the sequence, aborts the sequence, right? This is a little bit like escape, where maybe the user's tried paraphrase request and still doesn't understand and just wants to give up and get out of the sequence by aborting it. And finally, goodbye, bye, gotta go, all the variations of that will get into the closing of the conversation. It's kind of similar to quitting or logging out. You can't always get the user to do that, but when you do, you can do more things. You can do things like offer them, you can do another action in the last topic slot, which I didn't have time to talk about. Or even it helps you in knowing that the conversation's over and now you've got a unit that you can analyze. So anyway, so this is our recommended method, is that sort of, teach users, they can always say these 6 things, and this helps them get around the interface no matter what the topic is. It's entirely domain agnostic. Okay, and that's about all I have time for. Here's an example of those. This is a summary of the 4 parts of the framework: the interaction model, the content format, the pattern language, the navigation method. And the last one, these are the books that Gary was talking about. Studies in Conversational UX Design, that was out in 2018. That has contributions from a lot of other people as well. Conversational UX Design, that is probably out next month. This may not actually be the final cover. This is what the cover looks like currently, but Raphael's not happy with it. So it may actually look different. But it is Conversational UX Design, a practitioner's guide to the natural language, the natural conversation framework, and it's put out by ACM. And so keep your eyes peeled for that. That'll be available next month. And with that, I'll stop talking.
All right, thanks, Bob. That's awesome. And I should say that I had a chance to review the Conversational UX Design for ACM, and I actually talked Bob into giving this similar presentation to my Ethnography for Experience Design class when I was in San Francisco. And I'm constantly amazed at how Bob has figured out ways and also learned how to code, to apply conversation analysis. It's one of those techniques that when we were coming up as graduate students, people often wondered, well, what can you do with that? Those who weren't doing it, questioned it. And here's a great example of all the things you can do with conversation analysis and the ability to study conversations and talk and interaction. So with that, I want to turn it over. We have some time still for any questions. If you have any questions, please feel free to type it into the chat box. And as people might be doing that, I'll remind everybody that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our AACS Applied U YouTube site. So any questions about any of the content, about any projects Bob's working on, about conversation analysis? There's a lot of material out there. Charles Antaki has a great online tutorial. That's Antaki. If you want to know more about conversation analysis and how it works, you can feel free to reach out to me as well at gdavid@bentley.edu. Any questions for anybody about conversational UX? And I would say more broadly, conversational customer experience design or just experience design. As I'm waiting here to see if anybody types, Bob, I have a quick question for you. You might be able to comment on. Have there been any challenges, or how have engineer types, right? How have the engineers or the people who are doing the development, how have they responded to this kind of approach? Sometimes it's going to be kind of tricky to get people engaged with quote unquote qualitative data, but at the same time, this might actually give them a sense of the concreteness of talk.
It's mixed. Sometimes engineers will be happy that there is somebody who seems to know something about conversation who's willing to design it and build it and take it off their plate. On the other hand, engineers are also always worried about how hard is it going to be to implement this.
Right.
And they're, because they're often in charge of the implementation. Even when I'm building something, there is still a system architect, that's in charge of the whole application. They're always concerned, they always want to make it easier to implement. So sometimes you have to argue about why something that's a little more work to get done is better for the user experience. And that's exactly the same with any kind of UX design. You sometimes have to argue for why, it's a better user experience to have a more sophisticated feature.
Great. Thanks a lot. And I guess the mailman just showed up because Bob warned me if the dog started barking, that would be the mailman. Karen has a question. How have you adapted this to languages other than English, which have different syntax and conversational conventions?
So, the language component is different, right? And the natural language processing tools will be different. In terms of the interactional structure, I mean, what conversation analysts have found is that that's largely independent of language. Not entirely, but it largely is. For example, the expandable adjacency pair structure, conversation analysts working in all different kind of languages have found that that's a universal. It's about interaction rather than language. And so we can reuse a lot of it, but you'll always find some cultural or language things that are specific to one, and you have to do some adaptation.
Great. Another question. Julia asked, where to start if you need to add a conversational interface to an existing app? What is the right approach?
Well, of course, there's no right approach. That's a good question. I mean, there's a couple of things you can do. You can add a chat window that pops up, and that's used sort of on top of the application. I think that's fine. It's good to have it's best, I would say, if that conversational agent has some feedback from the main interface, the main graphical interface, so that when the users, say on a certain page in the main interface, that the conversational agent may know that, so it has context. So when the user starts asking questions, the agent is a little smarter about what the user is currently doing. On the other hand, you can also, like the travel agent I briefly showed, that's really kind of conversation driven. So we have a conversation window and we have a visual window, but really the visual window it's visual aid for the conversation window. So in that case, it's really more powered by the conversation. I don't know that there's a right way, but I think the integration of the two, so that the context is shared between the GUI and the conversational interface, is key.
Great. We have time for one more question from Pooja. Hi, Pooja. How can slang, which vary within the English language, be implemented into intelligent agent using conversation analysis?
I mean, I would say slang is a language issue, and so natural language processing tools have solutions for that. So, for example, you would create, if you have an entity of a certain kind, you would provide slang as synonyms for that entity, and you would also have variations in the training data for the intents that include that slang. I think slang is taken care of through the natural language processing, but I don't think it's necessarily an interactional issue.
All right, one more question from Julia, because she was nice enough to say she could hear us at the very beginning of the chat window. So what tools for voice prototyping can you recommend?
Tools for voice prototyping. That's a good question. I don't really have, my team builds pretty much all the tools. Well, we build our own tools. So either for voice prototyping, we build our own tools using components from IBM Cloud, so the different Watson services, and then also some of the tools are produced by the Watson services themselves. There's not a lot of, I don't know of any good generic tools for voice out there, really. I need better tools.
Well, with that, I will say thank you to Bob. And if anybody's curious more about this, you can just do a search online for Bob Moore, Conversational UX Design, and he'll pop right up in terms of his page at IBM Almaden with his team and all the work that they're doing. And again, you can find the 2 books, or at least one of the books is available now. But I know Bob is going to be at the UXPA in Burlington, in May, Bob? Is that right?
Yep, May 3rd, I think. Yeah.
May 3rd. And for any of you other UXPA folks out there in different cities, if you're interested in having Bob come and give this kind of talk to your group, I'm sure he'd be happy to do so. So I want to thank Bob for talking about his work in workplace practices, workplace studies, and conversation analysis.
Anytime.
Yeah, well, I might take you up on that. I want to thank everyone who signed up for, attended, and streamed the webinar. Please make sure you check out our other webinars at the Applied U YouTube site. Also, go to the AACS website at aacsnet.net for information regarding our upcoming annual meeting, which will be in Portland, Oregon, this coming October. If you're in the Portland area and you want to connect, happy to do some kind of meetup out there. We have a number of professional development training programs for non-conference participants to attend as well. I just want to remind everybody also that our next webinar will be in April, towards the end of April, it's looking like, with Dr. Jeff Toussaint, when he will be talking about managing diversity in organizations. So shifting topics here a little bit, we would like to keep things varied in Applied U webinars to kind of touch on all the different areas people might have an interest in. And as always, if you have any suggestions for topics or content you'd like us to cover, you can email me directly at gdavid@bentley.edu, and I'm happy to consider them. Once again, thank you so much, Bob. It was fantastic. And we'll try to get this up to the Applied U YouTube site as fast as possible. Everyone take care and have a great day.